Now, if you're the first ruler of Singapore, the first Prime Minister of Singapore, you've just been handed power by the British. Where does your power come from? Where does your legitimacy come from? You're not an indigenous people. You've won an election under very dubious circumstances where you've put your political opponents into cold storage. So what do? You take a leaf out of the previous colonial government. You reject democracy, you suspend individual rights, you continue to cripple all sorts of safeguards against your exercise of state power, etc., etc., by arguing that Singapore is an exceptional case. You argue for Singaporean exceptionalism. Why? You use the three myths of vulnerability, development, and meritocracy. So you say that Singapore is extremely vulnerable, right? And you focus on two events that define this, are central to this myth of vulnerability. The first is the Japanese occupation, right, which governments routinely cite as a massive shock and evidence of Singapore's vulnerability. But if you stop to think about it, why did Winston Churchill call Singapore, the fall of Singapore, the worst British military disaster since Yorktown? If Singapore was so vulnerable, why was the fall of Singapore such a shock? The fact is, Singapore was the least vulnerable place in Southeast Asia, and that's why its fall was such a shock. So the point I'm making is not that Singapore is invulnerable, but that if you look at the facts, Singapore, I think we can say at best, is no more or less vulnerable than anywhere else in Southeast Asia. And so to argue for an exceptional case of vulnerability is overblown. Then there's the logic of development, which says that before independence, Singapore was a poor country, and then the PAP made Singapore a rich country, right? Aided, of course, by the suspension of democracy and liberty. We know for a fact that by 1950, Singapore was already a fabulously rich country. Lee Kuan Yew himself in 1960, as his electoral fortunes declined, as he got more and more unpopular, kept going around saying, look, Singapore has the highest income in Asia. If you read the Straits Times 1960, he kept saying this to try and point out how good we were doing, right? And of course, Singapore did have the highest per capita income in Asia. In actual fact, the PAP's great achievement was not to make Singapore rich. Before independence, Singapore was rich, but it was also a very unequal and unfair place. It was very discriminatory towards its citizens. And so the PAP's great achievement was to make Singapore fair. It was to make Singapore a fair and equitable place where if you worked hard, you would gain a salary, you would gain returns, rewards commensurate with your effort. They understood that people work best when they are paid a fair wage and they are empowered and free from worrying about things like healthcare and education and housing. So the PAP's legacy is not as popularly assumed from the myths that we are told of enriching Singapore. It's of making Singapore a fair and equitable place. And of course, the third myth is meritocracy. And again, this myth needs to be understood in historical context. Now, the PAP, of course, itself was funded as a broad coalition of anti-colonial left-wing forces from a wide variety of backgrounds. You have, for example, in 1959, its candidates included academics and doctors, and civil servants and lawyers and accountants, and trade unionists and farmers, and barbers and carpenters and seamstress. So the PAP's first generation, the old guard that we celebrate so much, is an example of how great leadership talents can be found from people of all backgrounds, regardless of education, regardless of upbringing. But after the party split several times in the 50s and in the early 60s, the leadership needed people they could trust to fill the ranks, and so they turned to people they definitely could trust, people who were just like them. So these are friends, these are colleagues, these are relatives, people with talent, people who were very smart, but people who thought very much like the leaders of the PAP. And so power became increasingly concentrated in the hands of a very narrow elite. And over time, this has meant increasing homogeneity of thought, of values, of experience. They think alike, they feel alike, they believe the same things. And so multiple studies of Singapore's elite, including by Chris Tremuan over there, and most recently by Michael Barr, have showed that there are actually several predominant characteristics which characterize the vast majority of Singapore's elite. the strongest determinants, Ba found, the strongest determinants of elite status in Singapore is proximity to the inner circle of PAP leadership. The elite are overwhelmingly male, they're overwhelmingly ethnic Chinese, they're overwhelmingly upper class, they've attended a narrow range of schools. I think something more than 90% of scholarship holders come from just 4 schools. I think 2/3 from just 2 schools, right? And of course, because they're overwhelmingly male, they have, most of them have actively served in the military as scholar officers. And entry into this elite, right, is largely an accident of birth. Within this elite, don't get me wrong, within this elite, competition is very fierce and is meritocratic. But Singapore, according to Ba, is not only meritocratic within this narrow elite. So to get in there, to get in there is largely an accident of birth, the rest of Singapore is excluded by definition from the very beginning. And so this leads to the worst of all possible worlds, because you have a pre-selected elite who don't realize they're a pre-selected elite, who, because of the intense competition within the elite, believe that they have gotten to where they are through sheer hard work and therefore owe nothing to the rest of society for their position. And so likewise, to maintain these myths, vulnerability, development and meritocracy, the PAP, like the British, have used instruments of intellectual and legislative control. In particular, right, as it declined in popularity through the early 60s, the leadership faced this central conundrum of, do we accept the will of the people and lose the next election, or do we suppress it to consolidate our grip on power? And they chose the latter. So they have abandoned attempts to restore democratic normality, and instead they have reasserted Singapore's exceptionalism. Singapore's vulnerability was emphasized. Legislative dominance was used to legitimize regulatory oppression. The media was suppressed, and a monopoly was asserted over public discourse. All opposition has been depicted as subversive, and detention without trial has been used to remove the leadership of the political opposition. So if you look over the decades, the British have actually gone, the PAP has gone further than the British ever were able to or ever dared to. It is the PAP which succeeded in implementing the colonial policies of destroying Chinese education, shutting down Nanta, ending all Chinese schools. Right? It is the PAP which has created a new national narrative which actually celebrates the illiberality of colonial rule, by emphasizing the role of PAP in Singapore's development and asserting the superiority of the PAP's leadership. And state resources have been diverted towards the creating and demonstrating of the superiority of the elite, thus creating a self-fulfilling cycle. So opposition leaders are removed through legal processes, legal obstacles are thrown up in front of opposition parties, and legislations and detentions are timed to coincide with elections. And independent civil society, as many people here know, they only contribute to public discourse on the government's terms. Housing and education policy has been used to further cement control of citizens and the public discourse. And for me, the really sad thing is, Singaporean democracy worked. Between 1955 and 1963, Singaporeans went to the polls an average of once a year. And out of this short period emerged the policies which made Singapore world famous today. The HDB, the CPF, industrialization, a trilingual education system which produced a reasonably talented second generation of PAP leadership. All these great things. And then after the PAP had absolute control in 1968, what do we have? We have Stop at 2, the second industrial revolution, which leads to a 10% drop in GDP in just 1 year. We have the CPF being constantly fiddled with to the point where Hui Hui over there is organizing a protest every week against it. The HDB constantly drawing complaints. And that is the product of a lack of democracy, a lack of debate, a lack of dissent, a lack of new ideas in the government. And so the fact is Singaporean democracy actually worked. It produced a much fairer and equitable country, and it provided the basis for our current modern day success. So, to conclude then, what does this tell us about the nature of governance in Singapore? It talks about 3 myths of vulnerability and development and meritocracy. Well, Lee Kuan Yew years ago, he talked about how these were Asian values, right? The suspension of individual liberty over the needs of the state, Asian values, and he pointed to China. And actually, I think he got it half right. But what he forgot is that China was an empire long before it was Chinese. And that's what it shares in common with the Roman Empire and the British Empire. So what we have today, the nature of our governance in Singapore today, is an imperial government. It is a continuation of the colonial government. Thanks very much.